Thank you for attending tonight's presentation of the Toronto Audio Engineering Society. The Toronto Audio Engineering Society unites engineers socially. Within our allied arts, we collect, collate, and disseminate scientific knowledge that furthers all fields of audio engineering. The AES aims to empower people of all ages through participation in healthy, safe, open community presentations. Learn about audio engineering through events, presentations, networking, and mentorship. Visit www.torontoaes.org to join today. Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony. I'm the chair of the Toronto Audio Engineering Society section. Tonight's presentation about hearing is one that concerns us all and one that has a reaching impact across all disciplines of audio. So we're very happy to have such dedicated speakers and such privilege to have such a good presentation coming up tonight on hearing and infrastructure. So as we all know, COVID has changed the workflow. We're living in headphones. People are working from home, and multiple people have different sets of headphones. And what does it do to your ears? We were super curious. So Mariana Hutton is a mixing engineer based in Toronto, and Mariana will be presenting tonight as a host on the topic of hearing. Mariana has interviewed some fantastic speakers, and I know you're going to look forward to all of this, and you're going to get something huge out of it. I guarantee it. So Mariana is a mixing and mastering engineer based in Toronto who has been working in multiple genres ranging from jazz to rock to hip-hop. Hutton has a passion for the mentoring and audio education and is our membership executive for the Toronto AES. So if you would like to join the Toronto AES, go to torontoaes.org / I think it's join. There you will find information on how to become a member of the Toronto section. Mariana is also the co-director of Sound Girls Toronto chapters. So, the Toronto Audio Engineering Society is a very inclusive place, and we're very lucky to have Mariana do these presentations and participate in our executive. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass the proverbial microphone over to Mariana. Thanks again, everyone.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out and joining us on our meeting or event, however you like to call it, on hearing and audiology. I'm Mariana Hutton, and I'll be interviewing and introducing some of our guests tonight, which are very knowledgeable individuals in research and practice of hearing and audiology. So, make sure you put your headphones on, and let's enjoy the show. So, Jeremy, would you like to introduce yourself and your area of research and expertise for our audience?
With pleasure. My name is Jérémy Voix. I'm a full professor at the École de Technologie Supérieure in Montreal. So I've been a trained physicist and really had a passion for acoustics, since my teenage years. So it's been a while, and I'm now really specialized in mostly hearing protection, so hearing conservation, and working on advanced hearing conservation solutions and things like wearable and hearables.
Interesting, very, very interesting. So the first question that I have for you this evening is, now due to stay-at-home orders, engineers have had to move some of their setup to be able to work from home. This often entails working in apartments without speakers. What are the effects of working on headphones over a long period of time? How can we mitigate these effects? Are there other types of quiet listening that would be less damaging to hearing?
Okay, so the less damaging to hearing, statement is a little bit of odd things for me, because there is a little bit of a maybe urban legend or myth that having something in the ear closer to the eardrum might be inducing more damage or risk of damaging the hearing. And there is absolutely no literature really citing this.
Oh.
There are a couple of very interesting pieces that I'd like to highlight for your folks that are in the audio aspect. So first to start, you know that what we call damage risk criteria that are really those levels that you should not exceed per the, let's say, occupational safety regulations. So let's say 85 dB for 8 hours. This is what a worker in Canada can be exposed to. And those levels are actually measured in free field at the center of the head without the human subjects being present. So this is really a free field recording. And this is how those damage risk criteria have been established. And we always relate to that value in free field equivalent. But the thing is that now, if at the same time you would be exposing that subject to that sound field and measuring inside the ear, you would see actually a much larger level in the ear canal because of this PINA effect. You understand that this is an amplifier, natural amplifier, it's a horn, and it does boost frequencies in the mid-range by up to 15 dB. So that's a huge amplification that now when you're listening actually on earphones, you would have indeed to listen and you will have to crank them up 15 dB louder than your normal speaker because of that natural, amplification that is happening in the pinna. So there is sometimes that confusion of what we call the free field correction aspect that is misunderstood for being, for saying, well, those, in-ear devices are really too loud and too dangerous. So that's one. There is another one which is a little bit much more subtle, but again, what we call the loudness, which is really the physical or psychophysical sensation of how loud something is actually a little bit related on what is providing the sound source. So if this is a loudspeaker, earmuffs as you do have, or in-ear device as I do have, for the same sound pressure level at the eardrum, the loudness might be different just because of some complicated but psychophysical artifacts, sometimes referred to as the missing 6 dB. Some people can go back in the archives of AES and find some discussion on that. And related on that, just another thing too is that when you're listening to speakers, you know that not only your ears are sensing those air vibrations, but your whole body, and you know that from your parties and night experience that this is really a physical thing. So the fact that you're listening on earphones sometimes lead to the impression that you need to probably put more level in order to have that same feeling and comfort. So just to say that listening on earphones is not necessarily more dangerous, and you're not really at risk while listening at home on any personal devices. The only word of caution is obviously that if you have to listen for long hours, you should really make sure that you reduce the level. And you know that what matters is not so much the instantaneous level per se, but really what we call the dose, which is the duration times the level. So level times the duration. And now, if you have to listen to loud levels, for whatever reason, mixing things and so on, well, do so, but make sure that this is a reduced duration, because again, this is dose that matters, and that is the key to those dangerous levels. So on really what you can do in practice, there are more and more devices that will, in the near term, support that dose assessment. So again, level times time. And I'm referring to an initiative I'm part of, which is part of the World Health Organization, which is called Make Listening Safe. And this is really the initiative that all consultants, academics, manufacturers would gather around the table to define how we can actually assess that dose on your personal music player, PMP, and limit it. And you may see some devices that are coming nowadays, from Californian companies and so on, that do have some kind of indication, and there would be others coming up. So it's getting some traction, and you will be able to assess for yourself how dangerous your listening experience has been or not.
Oh, that's great. That's great that that's coming up. Wow. Yeah, I mean, cell phones now already have you can set up a limit, right?
That's right. And you used to,
personal.
Even 20 years ago, I remember in Europe having those AVLS, so automatic volume limiter systems that were very, very basic level limiters. But nowadays, the idea is really that you limit the dose, and more important than limiting, the idea is really to inform. So the analogy that I do with the dose is, let's say you're listening to a mix and you're on the airplane and you'll be landing in London soon, and the system will actually, monitor your current level and the cumulative dose that you had from your beginning of the flight, let's say, and we'll say, well, you know what, Marina, you'll be in 30 minutes, you'll be reaching your 100% dose. So are you fine with this? Because that's in half an hour that it should shut you down. So if you're fine with this, this is fine. But if you're in the middle of your flight, maybe you just be turning your music down in order to increase that maximum duration, right?
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, I remember learning a bit of that when I was in audio school. I got educated on that. I was very, very lucky to have professors that cared about our hearing. Were teaching us about carrying, about getting audiograms and all that stuff. I was very fortunate. So the second question that I have for you is, what research has been done regarding recovering hearing loss? Has there been any progress regarding recuperating some ranges in hearing that have been lost? I've been hearing some pretty encouraging treatments regarding tinnitus. What findings can you share regarding that, if you have any?
Okay. So let's divide the hearing loss per se. There has been for real, and for a long time, I mean, real, attempts at finding therapeutics and drugs and treatments that would indeed help you recover some of hearing loss. So far, there are some promising, North American, Massachusetts-based companies that did range, I guess, phase 2 trials and trying to, inject in the middle ear some drugs that would actually alleviate some of your, noise-induced hearing loss. But again, this is important to mention that this is only for noise-induced hearing loss, not for the aging of the ear, the presbycusis that happens and cannot absolutely not be recovered yet. So that's the first limitation. Still, it's a long shot. There has been ups and downs. Things haven't been easy for them and other companies, as far as I know. And it's not there yet. And it's quite invasive. It's injection again in the middle ear. So it's not, the simple pill that you take before going to gym clubs or whatever. And there has been as well on the other side, let's say, extreme side, so military personnel exposed to IED devices, so exploding and being completely blasted and so on, probably bleeding from the ears and so on. There are there are treatments that do exist that are really special cocktails with steroids and the like, but they are really experimental, not there yet, and so nothing really to prevent noise-induced hearing loss as we speak. While we know that other species, birds and so on, can regenerate those outer hair cells, we do not as human beings yet. On the tinnitus side, this is interesting because indeed there was a lot of good news, I guess, during the last fall, with regard to, as I would say, two things. So one was a treatment that is now involving what is called neuromodulation, which is a bimodal neuromodulation. So you typically stimulate through electrical discharges on the tongue. At the same time, you're producing audio events. And this is an Irish-based company, I think, that has some preliminary results that are very promising. And there is still a need for some further validation, and real trials. There was also an interesting study from an Australian group, Bionics Hearing, that is dealing with the imaging of the tinnitus. So being really able to, because that tinnitus by definition is something that you hear, but that is not present in the environment. So you cannot record it, you cannot measure it, and nobody else can experience it. So how can you really see that it's affecting and is mapped on your auditory cortex? Well, using functional near-infrared spectroscopy, we can now see those effects, and this is obviously a big, I think, enabler for a lot of research coming up. And in terms of there are definitely, not that much treatments, unfortunately. I would say that, I can just recap the general understanding of a tinnitus nowadays is that basically this is your all your neurons and synapses that are just free gaming. So the idea is that if you have some hearing losses, that happens in some frequencies, and that the ear has what we call a tonotopic organization. So frequencies are mapped. So this is low, this is medium, this is high, and extremely high. And the idea is that if suddenly you have one fiber or one outer hair cell that is destroyed by hearing loss, so let's say the high frequency, what will happen is that along the chain that goes to the brain, let's imagine my arm is my central auditory system, what will happen is that basically that all those neurons and synapses and nerves that are feeding that information to the cortex are free, and they have nothing to do. What they will do is basically free fire and send those tones that are really linked to the hearing loss. So now we understand that where you have hearing loss, you have tinnitus. And one of the ideas is actually what we call stimulation in the loss. And so one of the ideas is to send tones that are really aimed at those deaf parts of your body, to realign them and give them some data to process and to treat, and to avoid them to be, firing at random stage. So this is stimulation dans la perte. And that's one approach. The other approach are obviously the old thing of masking, those annoying sounds. Some of the, cognitive or I would say behavioral therapies, and, living to learn with it and those kind of things. But I guess this is definitely one project we have on the stimulation of those dead zones, let's say. So
that's very interesting. Yeah. So next question, will be, hearing aid often does not offer the best representation of real sounds. It often misses many frequencies. Many users complain that the equalization on them is made only for listening to speech, simplifying and often ruining the experience of hearing other things like music. Has there been any progress in research and new technologies with better hearing aids?
Yeah, so there is a lot of research being conducted. And there are a lot of researchers and heavy companies that are behind all those hearing instruments, as they call them. One thing that you have to remember is that really the damaged cochlea, so the inner ear, once it's damaged, has a couple of unique features. And the first one that is that the threshold of hearing is elevated, right? You don't hear those very faint noises and low levels. But what is that the threshold of pain, so the maximum level you can hear, did not change. So what happens is that you're moving your floor noise or your floor and the top, and you're just moving the floor up. So now you have a limited bandwidth and dynamic bandwidth. So you understand that from the audio processing aspect. And what happens as well is that in terms of frequency sensitivity, you lose those high frequency first. This is how presbyacusis is happening. And you'll be actually using now a reduced frequency window. So now you have both the dynamic and the frequency range that have been reduced. And now you're asking me to pass the same amount of information, which is a musical piece or score, through that, narrowed pipe. That obviously doesn't work. Worse than that, the damaged cochlea has really lost its ability to discriminate in between frequencies. And this is very important because you understand that the ear is a filter, a comb filter. It has what we call cochlear filters that are really tuned to different frequencies. And those shapes are really, really sharp. But as the cochlea is damaged, those shapes are widening. And now you have an ear that is not discriminating just one frequency, but a whole frequency range. And no wonder that when you do have, noise and speech, well, somebody with a damaged cochlea, somebody with hearing loss, and even a hearing aid won't be able to discriminate speech from noise, will be really handicapped because of that overlapping, the fact of their lack of resolution in the cochlear filters frequency. So those are really, things that you cannot really change, unfortunately. But there is a lot of research, as I said, and the idea to really narrow down to start what you need to pass. So now, you are affected with a hearing loss. Well, understanding speech is really key because speech is what connects us. We are connected through speech and a little bit of visual, but this is key. So I don't want to lose that aspect of speech, and I don't care for your ambient noise environment. And passing speech may be that in the hearing aid, I will now focus using some beamforming microphones, directional microphone, cardioid microphone, beamforming on the person in front of me because I want to understand that person. And any gain I do in signal to noise ratio is a huge help for my damaged cochlea. So that's this kind of microphone instrumentation. You can obviously remove the noise and all those artifacts from the speech you want to understand. Here, the machine learning is really helping a lot because there is indeed a lot of processing that can be done at least on powerful computers. One of the questions is how can you really implement that on a small DSP, digital signal processor chip, with a reasonable power consumption. But there are, let's say, many avenues. And, the ultimate goal of those, companies, and, 5 companies are maybe owning 90% of the market. I don't have the exact figures, but that's ballpark the values, is really to have what we call the cognitive control of the hearing aid. So the idea is that hearing aid nowadays, with their digital processors, the microphones I mentioned, and so on, are able to really select pick-up speech. This is good, but let's say that you have 3 people in front of you. Which one would you be paying attention to? And you can only listen to one for the reasons I mentioned before. So one of the ideas is that we tap into what we call the efferent system. So the system that feeds back the ear from the upper cortex. And we actually say to the hearing aid which stream of audio information we are interested in. So this is an idea that you can be locked on the source and get rid of the others, which is a little bit futuristic, but that's the holy grail of hearing aids, as we say. So we call that cognitive control of hearing aids.
Wow, that's amazing. I never heard that, especially like the using beamforming. Like, wow, I never thought, but it's true. That would be a way of focusing hearing on one subject. That's amazing.
As long as the person is in front of you, right?
Yeah, exactly. So here we have another one, and this is related to people like me, more like the audio engineering world. So how often would or should audio engineers get an audiogram of the ears, and how should they consider these findings into their workflow? Would you recommend applying DSP in their monitoring, like equalization, to compensate for the areas in their hearing that are missing sensitivity?
Yeah. So first of all, the audiogram is a very, very basic and antique, test in terms of hearing sensitivity. And there's even the trend nowadays to say that there are maybe even hidden hearing loss, in the sense that people with normal audiograms could actually still from hearing loss. And you will see that actually exactly in the situation I was describing, is that they are not very good at discriminating speech in noisy environments. So audiogram is actually not a very good storyteller for that reason. But worse than that, the audiogram is in a sense useless, because it tells you after the fact how your hearing is. And so it will be basically documenting, for example, that you have a hearing loss. It's not telling you, well, be careful, Mariana, you are overexposed. So it doesn't prevent, it's not no predictor in any sense. So you'd be just documenting, years after years that your hearing is damaging, and you don't know exactly from what exposure or what situation and so on, which is, I think bad. So to answer your question, in the occupational health and safety world where I'm coming from, it's recommended by all standards and regulations that workers be tested every year, so once annually. So I would say, well, you should at least go to the, for a screening test or a full-blown audio test, audiological test, at least once a year. But I would say maybe you could opt for other tests than audiograms. So just testing your threshold of hearing is not sufficient for the reason I told you. And there are other more sensitive or more sensible, accurate, let's say, measurements, like what we call the autoacoustic emissions. So autoacoustic emissions are a response that your inner ear has when it's being sent 2 signals. So this is a little bit of a funny, I'll give you the funny explanation. You send basically an F1 frequency, a pure tone, beep, another one F2, so beep. And then what will happen is that those tones propagate through the ear and inside the cochlea. And here there is a cochlear amplifier that actually amplifies those sounds mechanically. But by doing so, it creates what you know as being intermodulation distortion, which is something you try to avoid in your mix, I guess. But here it happens. And that F3 frequency, which is exactly 2F1 minus F2, will happen. So it's happening at a very known frequency, F3. And it's a very faint signal, which is that comes back and travels back to the ear. So if you have a very sensitive microphone, you can record that F3. After you send the 2 tones, F1, F2 together, you record F3. And this is what we call the distortion product in the autoacoustic emission world. And from that F3, you know that, well, the cochlea is working and there is all this cochlear amplifier that works well. And this is actually a test that is being used nowadays more and more in Canada for the newborns. So if you want to make sure that the peripheral system of a newborn is functional, you don't have to have an audiogram and have the newborn raise the hand. It won't happen. So what you do is you use those probes. This is really a clinical setup, and you assess if the ear is functional. So that only works and assess the peripheral system, doesn't tell you that it's properly wired and connected. There may be other issues, but at least that's a quick test, and that will diagnose things before the acquisition of language and all the development of a normal kid. So that's very useful, and it's now used more and more in the occupational world. We see autoacoustic emissions be used as an early indicator of a hearing loss and to prevent hearing loss. So I can see, you may be overexposed, and then I could see, okay, what is causing this and reducing the source. So for you, in practice, I would, and recommend to all you and your colleagues to try to find, some good clinical audiologists that do have access to OAE, autoacoustic emissions tools, and to just track that years after years, because there is no normative data. We can't tell, okay, this is a good hearing, or this is not a good hearing. OAE are very personal, but one thing we know is that they are relative to you. So if you have a baseline and you move from that baseline, this is an indication that, well, maybe there is something wrong with you, and this is a very good and early indicator.
For more information on the Toronto section of the Audio Engineering Society, go to torontoaes.org. The Toronto AES is sponsored by Solotech, Gear Audio, Sonotechnique, Bell Media, YSL Pro, Electrosonics Canada, BRTB, Global USS, Adamson, Lawo, and avshop.ca.
Very good. Wow, that's I've never heard of that for testing, actually, hearing. Well, the only thing I've ever heard were audiograms, so that's new for me. Now I know what you get. And that's a really good answer about what you said about how we change from your baseline, right? Because everybody here listens differently. Everybody's ear is different, so.
Yeah. And so, but now your question, and this is really the deaf soundman issue. I've been to a lot of concerts and events and parties where actually I was suspecting just from the audio balance that the guy at or the female, whatever, at the sound console was actually maybe suffering from some kind of, hearing loss or hearing damage. And so this is indeed a very good and clever, a trick is to say, well, if you're mixing, mastering, doing things, make sure that you don't, blueprint all your recordings with your bad hearing. And so this is probably interesting research project to see, could you have your custom tuned EQ just to match for your ear or your impacted ear and so on. But definitely you've been to those places and you know that, and having a deaf someone is not a good experience for the audience, I would say.
No, definitely not. So I've got a couple more questions. So the way the human brain adapts to its environment is it's amazing. Can you provide some information about how the brain readjusts itself to changes caused by damage or even an accident?
So indeed, there are very, very good and fun experiments we did more as technology enabling people, because as I said, we design wearables and those kind of tools, but we had a research team at Université de Montréal, very specialized in what we call brain plasticity and auditory plasticity. So how does the auditory cortex rebranch and reconfigure as you change conditions? And so one of their idea was to look at those tonotopic information. So again, you remember that frequencies are really mapped physically on all those nerves and all the auditory pathway. And basically figure that this is your keyboard, a piano keyboard, and you have one frequency, 1 kilohertz, and you have the neighbor one, which is 800 hertz, and the upper one, which is 101.2 kilohertz. And what will happen if you suddenly don't use the 1 kilohertz anymore? Will the brain do something about this? And so the researcher, Mark Schoenwisner at the time, asked us to design a device that was a pure, transparent wearable. So you would hear absolutely normally everything around you with good high fidelity and so on. And but there would be a notch filter completely rejecting the 1 kilohertz frequency. And so what Mark did in his study, he would do a functional MRI. So really mapping those cortical activities and those frequencies on the auditory cortex. And he would see 800 hertz, 1 kilohertz, 1.2 kilohertz very clearly stimulated as you would sense swipe, pure tone noises and so on. And then he listened for a week with this device on and did periodically retest. And now the fact that he cut completely the 1 kilohertz that was notched out from everything he was experiencing. And so at first he noticed that there was really no activity on that 1 kilohertz band because obviously there was no signal being transmitted. So that was clear. But after a couple of days, he realized that the two adjacent frequencies, 800 and 1 kilohertz, 2 kilohertz, slowly but surely went back to feed and use that those neurons and synapses that were idle and available for free. So this is really how the brain remapped itself. And what was really new, and that was just a couple of years back, is that he actually realized that just over a couple of days, and I think that was something like a week, in 1 week, he already had that reprogramming and repiping of this information in the brain. So yeah, when you said that there is a lot of plasticity and capabilities, that's definitely true. And that's just, there are a couple of ones, but I think we'll cut there. But there are, other ones we can do that are very funny.
Well, that's very interesting. Yeah, like it's amazing, and that's more related to neuroscience, right? It's more like a perception. It's more in the brain, right? How it's processed.
That's right. That's processed. Do you have time for a second one?
Yeah.
So the second one is same research team, is about the localization. So how do you localize where a sound is coming from? You know that you're using two cues. One is that click reached my ear here first, so before the second ear, because it was closer. So we call that the interval time difference. There's a slight delay for my second ear. The other difference is that if this is on my left, I have a skull which is blocking some high frequencies. So I won't hear those high frequencies with this right ear as good as with my left ear. So this is what we call, I did told, well, I just lost the word, but this is a frequency resolution. And then what we were asked to do was to produce actually the same devices that would just delay all the sounds on one ear. So suddenly all the sounds, even if you're in front of me currently, Mariana, you would be speaking to me in real world, and I would hear you from my left. Why? Because there was an added delay artificially on my right ear. So same story. People, you do imaging, you do what we call sound source localization capabilities, and you realize that as soon as you're fitting the device, you ask people to close their ears. Mariana is speaking in front of me, but I will be pointing to my left. Why? Because there is a delay on my right ear, which is completely normal. Then you let those people go back to home and hopefully not be run by a car when they cross the street, but you let them experience the device. And after a couple days, you have them back in the lab and you ask them same story. So there is still a delay. Marina is speaking in front of me. And now when you ask them, okay, can you point to Mariana? And they point right in front of them. So now the brain, and understood that, Mariana, although she appeared to be on my left, she's in front of me. And so now you remove the device a minute after and you redo the test. And Mariana is speaking in front of me. What do you think will happen? Where will they be pointing at?
Let me unmute myself. Yeah, like the direction where the person is.
Well, actually, you would expect that they just shifted everything. So you may, expect that they would be pointing a little bit to the right now because they just corrected, this error. But you are correct. They actually point right in the middle. So they are still correct. Even if you add or not the delay, they still point you to the right direction. And so now what happens is that the cue that we call the interval time difference is fighting against what we call the ILD. I forgot the acronym. That was interval level difference. And the brain just realized that actually time difference is not relevant. This is not a good indicator because Mariana could be in front of me. My eyes see her in front of me while I hear her on the left. So this is not a good cue. I should rather focus on the ILD, which is better cue. And indeed, this is how they could compensate for the weighting of those two parameters that was demonstrated in that study.
That's very interesting. And actually, I use that technique on mixing. Like I delay when I have like a stereo signal, I delay the right or the left. And then the one that I delayed, I actually raise the volume on that one so that when you're listening to the mix, your ear, it doesn't sound like it's too to the left or too much to the right, you know? Because then it sounds more stereo, it sounds more wide, like the perception is that it's wider, but also it doesn't sound like it's tilting towards any side. So I definitely, you know, knowing a bit how human hearing works does help, you know? So, like final question is, you know, I'm a 30-year-old audio engineer and I'm wondering, how I can optimize the length of my career and the considerations I should keep, like other than the obvious ones, you know, don't be exposed to loud noises over long periods of time. Has there been any research about like diet and lifestyle that improves like hearing that can, you know, make you, I mean, when you age, you are going to lose hearing. Like it's normal, right?
Yeah.
Even if you're really careful.
Absolutely.
But is there any type of diet that actually helps extend the health of your hearing?
So as far as I know, you know, there are sometimes, you know, here and there are a couple, you know, studies that tells you that, well, caffeine, you know, coffee once a day, you know, protects and is not bad. And, you know, the other guy that would claim something different and so on. So there may be some truth to it, and it's certainly worth exploring. I think the difficulty is really from a methodological point of view is that it's a very longitudinal study. You have to keep that same control group for years, control to a placebo group or a control group, sorry. And so it's not obvious to run those studies and have a very clear answer. I think still that it's really a holistic picture, and global health is actually, probably the response to good hearing. What is, I would say, a little bit, interesting is the idea of practicing your hearing. So, we have Murray Schafer in Canada, who's been probably the first person introducing the idea of a soundscape, and actually having a book on sound education, and pun intended, but that was really the idea of, well, how can you train your hearing and be better and so on. And I really, believe in this, just like we know from the fact that trained ears, musicians' ears and so on, do perform very differently brain-wise than non-trained ears. So I think there's really something there to be gained. It's a little bit of a muscle to be practiced. So on top of the, how you food or fuel and feed that, muscle, it's really how you use it and practice it. I think there is something there, but that's a little bit personal. I don't have data on that.
Thank you so much. That was a great answer, actually. It makes so much sense. I mean, I actually do. I'm familiar with that work, and so my professors back when I used to be in school were big fans of Schaefer. So I still do to this day. I go on walks and I just pay attention to my surrounding, and I make a list in my mind of everything that I'm hearing, and it really helps me with mixing, with noticing, compartmentalizing elements in mixing. And, when clients come up to me and they ask me to replicate the sound of something else, it's a lot easier because I'm able to separate things like that. So, yeah. Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us, and I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was great meeting you. Have a good night.
It was awesome questions. Thank you very much for your interest.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Thank you for attending tonight's presentation of the Toronto Audio Engineering Society. The Toronto Audio Engineering Society unites engineers socially. Within our allied arts, we collect, collate, and disseminate scientific knowledge that furthers all fields of audio engineering. The AES aims to empower people of all ages through participation in healthy, safe, open community presentations. Learn about audio engineering through events, presentations, networking, and mentorship. Visit www.torontoaes.org to join today.
That was great. So before we move on to our next interview, I'd like to talk a bit about how to become a member if you're not a member of the AES yet, so that you can have access to all of the wonderful resources that you get as a member. So some of these are access to great papers, discounts on amazing books, and of course, once there are, physical events that you can attend, there's also discounts to attend these conferences that the AES puts up. And if you're a student, there is reduced pricing as well. And it's a wonderful opportunity for networking and sending your recordings for competitions so that they get recognized before you even graduate. So there are many benefits to being a member. And even during the pandemic, it may seem that there is no point, but there is actually a community there still operating and helping each other during these tough times for us involved in audio. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce our next guest. And the first thing I would like to do is, would you introduce yourself to our audience this evening?
I'm a world famous skateboarder. No, I can't skateboard. I can't skateboard. I tried. My name is Marshall Chasen. I'm an audiologist and director of research at the Musicians Clinics of Canada. The website that I'll be talking about today, because it is a wealth of information, is simply musiciansclinics.com for both those words. I have some adjunct appointments to the University of Toronto in linguistics and to Western Ontario in audiology, and SUNY Buffalo as a research associate there. I've written about 8 to 9 books. I lost track. And one of the books actually is self-published, where I give it to my patients, and it's called Hear the Music. And Mariana, what I think I'll do after this is I'll send you a PDF so any AES members that want to obtain a free copy of the PDF, by all means, contact her, or you can contact me and I'll just send you a PDF.
Oh, that's excellent. That's excellent. Thank you so much.
So that's all I am. I'm a black belt in karate. We'll see what else. That's what it is.
Great. Amazing. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So first question for you is, now due to stay-at-home orders, engineers have had to move some of their setup to be able to work from home. This often leads to working in apartments without speakers. What are the effects of working on headphones over a long period of time? And how can we mitigate these effects? Are there other types of quiet listening that would be less damaging to hearing?
These are all good questions. There is nothing inherently wrong with using headphones, whether it's, and I'm going to date myself now, whether it was the 1980s with the Sony Walkmans, the 1990 with CD players, or the current MP3 players. The only damage that you could run into with headphones is because the device might be portable. When you take your MP3 player on the street, you're jogging, let's say, or a truck goes by, or you walk by a construction site, you turn up the volume. And in both cases, it's comfortably loud, but one is maybe not a damaging level. Maybe it's less than 85 decibels, and the other one is damaging over 85 decibels. So as humans, we're absolutely wonderful at discerning differences in pitch. Some slightly better than others, but we know whether something is sharp or something is flat. But as humans, we're awful at discerning differences in loudness. If I ask a musician to play a mezzo forte sound on his or her instrument, they may play it at 85 decibels. Their bandmate or a friend might play at 95 decibels, both mezzo forte or average levels. We're just not great at discerning differences of loudness. But as long as you're in a relatively quiet environment, like your home office or your earphones, there should be no major difference. If you are, there is a subtle difference in the lower frequencies. I don't know if you recall the difference between minimal audible field and minimal audible pressure. Minimal audible pressure simply means wearing earphones, and minimal audible field through the loudspeakers. And if you look at the difference between these two curves, they do differ in the lower frequencies, with the minimal audible pressure being poor sensitivity. That is, it has to be much louder before you can hear the lower bass notes. Like, for example, 125 hertz, minimal audible pressure in your phones, it takes about 45.5 decibels just to become audible. Whereas with loudspeakers, minimal audible field, it might be 25 decibels. So there's a 20 decibel difference. The difference actually being the vascular noise, you're hearing blood vessels in your head and they're rushing in the blood. And that's the primary reason. It's not necessarily because you're occluding the ear versus not occluding the ear. So you might have to have it a little bit louder to get a better bass response on the earphones than from the loudspeakers, but slightly, not a big difference.
I see. Thank you very much. That was a very similar response to the one that Jeremy gave. It was similar, but also like a different perspective on it. So that was very interesting.
Probably much better than Jeremy's.
Thank you so much. Here's the next one. What research has been done regarding recovering hearing loss? Has there been any progress regarding recuperating some ranges in hearing that have been lost? I've also been reading some encouraging treatments regarding tinnitus. What findings can you share regarding that, if there are any?
Well, to answer the first part of the question, that's the holy grail. Is there a pharmaceutical and medication that can regrow the neural structures in your ear? And just taking a step backwards here, the ear is made up of three parts. The outer ear, of course, and the only thing that becomes a difficulty or problem is wax occlusion, temporary. Then you have middle ear problems, and children get ear infections, but adults do too. And regardless whether it's an outer ear or middle ear problem, that's usually medically treatable, and it's usually temporary in nature. The inner ear, which is the size of my small fingernail, the tip ear. Oh, by the way, you know what this is? It's metric, but it's about right. It just fits perfectly. But that little area, I speak to a lot of American audiences. But that little small little volume in the inner ear has 13 to 15,000 nerve endings. So think of those as 13 to 15,000 microphones. And when some of those microphones don't work, it's rarely not it's rarely an all or none. Usually it's just a degree of loss of its sensitivity. And once it gets to a certain point, you can actually have damage. And actually, we have microphones, or at least nerve endings that send the sound in, like transducers, more like a loudspeaker. And then we have other nerve endings in the ear that receive sound from the brain, from other neurological structures. And that truly is a microphone. And then these microphones communicate with the loudspeakers, and there's a loop that goes on. And depending on the nature of the loop, that's how we can hear a very soft sound. The ear is a very active and very interesting mechanism. And if you're interested, there's that book I referred you to called Hear the Music. And either you can email Mariana or myself, and I'll make sure you have a PDF. Patients that I see clinically, I actually give them a copy of that book, and it just describes this in detail. To date, there has not been really any success in regrowing nerve endings in the inner ear from mammals. Birds, amphibians, yes. But mammals seem to have a little molecular switch that turns off this ability to regrow nerve endings. There was a study that came out in September in Johns Hopkins where they were talking about the molecular switch in some lower mammal rodents. And it could be that if we take this in conjunction with some of the other techniques that have been successful with birds and with reptiles, we might be more successful. We can grow nerve endings or little microphones in a little petri dish, and it will structurally look like a nerve ending, but it doesn't always function like a nerve ending. So it's something that we're still working on. Earlier on, and I would say earlier, meaning up to 2 or 3 years ago, of those nerve endings that they could regrow, many of them became cancerous and continued to grow and took over something and destroyed everything. So we're certainly not there yet. Now, there are some pharmaceuticals that are coming down the pipeline, some in phase 3 trials in the Food and Drug Administration, that you can take just before a loud exposure. So if you're going to a gig or you're going to be doing something noisy, you take it as a pill, and it can mitigate the effects of the loud music or loud noise on the ears. One is called Epsilon. Actually, I'm going to share my screen for a second. I'm going to share a slide by Colleen Laprelle's lab in University of North Texas. I don't know if you can see it well here, but on the right, this is what's called the TTS paradigm, temporary threshold shift. That is, when you do this on animals, you can create a hearing loss and see if there's less or more of a hearing loss. But with humans, of course, we can't create a permanent hearing loss. So we create something called a temporary hearing loss or temporary threshold shift. And what they do is they take these volunteers and they measure their hearing before an exposure to loud music or loud noise. The one on the left is music, the one on the right is noise. But it's the same spectrum, really. And then they measure, then they give them 15 minutes of loud noise or loud music. And then they measure their hearing a second time. So it's the difference between before and after. And that's your temporary threshold shift. It's something that usually resolves in 16 to 18 hours. We all go to a gig and our ears are ringing a little bit and feeling full. And if I was to actually test your hearing just before and just after, there would be a temporary difference. So what they did, they used this drug called Epsilon, well, you can't spell it right. It's on the slide though. Ebselen. And what they found is that the black is the placebo, the no effect. And at the very top where the green line is, shows the before hearing. And it turns out that if you give them 600 milligrams twice a day, or even 200 milligrams twice a day, it helps a little bit, not a lot. But there's a sweet spot, 400 milligrams, the green curve, barely any hearing loss. So if you're going to hear about these medications, be very careful about the dosage. Too little is no good. Too much is no good. You have to find the sweet spot. Incidentally, while I have the screen up on the left, this is just using a supplement made of beta-carotene, vitamin C, E, magnesium, and there's no difference. You can see that giving the vitamins, the hearing loss after is almost the same as before. Now, how do I unshare the screen? Stop share, I see. It's so high-tech. There we go.
Perfect.
There are medications coming down, but be careful about what the dosage is. Dosage is everything. Okay? Oh, you've asked about tinnitus too. I just attended a 2-day session on tinnitus yesterday and the day before. We do know that tinnitus is a brain thing, not an ear thing. That is, it's caused by an insult to the ear, such as hearing loss, such as aging, such as certain medications and pharmaceuticals. If you have a hearing loss, even a temporary one from going to a loud gig, the hearing is a little bit poor. That is, the thousands upon thousands of microphones in the ear just don't transduce the sound up to the brain. In the auditory cortex, right about there, the brain cell says, where's the sound? And it starts generating its own sound. And that's the tinnitus that we perceive. And we can actually see it on MRI studies. And so it's definitely there. We do know that if we withdraw ourselves from the noisy location, we can actually, if it's short term, resolve it or stop it. There are some people with permanent hearing losses, maybe because they're 75, 80 years old, maybe because they're working at a factory, or maybe they're a sound engineer that maybe overdid it in the early years, perhaps. For a number of reasons, they do have ringing or tinnitus in their ears. And there are some therapies that can be used, not to cure it. There's no cure, but to certainly supplement it. There is one source that has all the great data all in one place called the ATA, American Tinnitus Association, ATA.org. And if you click on that, you'll be sure that the stuff you read is validated, current, it's not just somebody's opinion. There are some consensus statements on there. Consensus is just your opinion, but these are opinions of some really smart people. So there's no cure to tinnitus. We do know that hearing aids are usually the front line of defense. 56% of people that wear hearing aids notice a significant reduction in their tinnitus. Usually not the day they get the hearing aid. Usually it's a period of time. The brain needs time to adapt or get used to itself. So after 5 or 6 months, you'll find that the tinnitus is less and less. During this time of COVID, it's really bad because we can't go outside. We're stressed. Everything about life during COVID is stressed. And stress is a big killer. Now, stress isn't just this airy-fairy word I'm using. In the 1960s, for those that are old enough to remember that, there was something called the mind-body connection. And stress was called the big killer. It would strip your kidneys, your heart, every liver, everything in your body. What we kind of metaphorically thought that it was the big killer in the 60s, we now know today is true. And we know the biochemistry. If you ever look in a book on stress, it's all biochemical equations and processes and hydrogen atoms being stripped off and going this way and that way. But the way it works, a short form for stress, and in fact, at the molecular level, the effects of stress are identical to the effects of loud noise. This is what happens. If we're stressed, cortisol is emitted from the adrenal glands, and that's one of the stress hormones. Cortisol is a physically small molecule, and it's one of the few that can cross the blood-brain barrier to get into the brain. The cortisol gets into the brain and facilitates an increase in a neurotransmitter substance. That is, between the neurons, we have these wires and we have these spaces called synapses. And in that space, we have dopamine and serotonin, and I'm sure you've heard of those. But you may not have heard of glutamate. Glutamate is the neurotransmitter substance we need for ears and hearing. Also vision, by the way. Turns out that high levels of cortisol facilitate higher levels of glutamate, and the glutamate at higher levels is toxic to the ear and can exacerbate a hearing loss. And that's why people that are more stressed or view something negatively have statistically a slightly greater hearing loss than those people that are more happy and are not near stressed. So being happy is not protective, but being stressed will give you a negative effect, and it can certainly exacerbate the tinnitus. So I can't talk about tinnitus without saying that you must find things that will de-stress you. And there are a number of online cognitive behavior therapy programs, such as, I'm going to spell it wrong, www.I, I guess that's for online or internet-based, CBT, Cognitive Behavior Therapy. So it's ICBT the number 4, tinnitus. And I believe it's .com. And if you go to the site in England, they actually have these little free modules you can click on about mindfulness and masking and all the things to relax you. And I think it's definitely worthwhile. So that's ICBT the number 4, tinnitus.com. I will take you to that site. How's that for better than Jeremy, that answer?
That was a very complete answer. Very, very complete. Now, Jeremy's was also great. But it's funny because the information is not completely overlapping. You're like complementing each other, which is great.
Well, I've got more hair than he does.
Yeah, yeah. Like that's really interesting. I never heard about taking that substance to help with mitigate hearing loss. I've never heard of that. Now I'm going to take that before going to a show. once we can have shows, right?
You can look it up and either type in oto protectant, OTO, meaning ear protectant, or some people refer to them colloquially as chemical earmuffs, which is the name.
Cool. That's really cool. Also, like what you mentioned about stress, that's certainly something that it's so important. And this is not, directly related to hearing, but I'm pretty sure in a few years, once we look back at the whole way we dealt with the COVID situation, a lot of people are going to have long-term health effects from all the stress that this entire thing has caused, right? Mm-hmm. We still haven't noted, we still can't judge that, right? But in a few years, I think statistically it's going to show. Let's hope for the best.
For more information on the Toronto section of the Audio Engineering Society, go to torontoaes.org. The Toronto AES is sponsored by Solotech, Gear Audio, Sonotechnique, Bell Media, YSL Pro, Electrosonics Canada, BRTB, Global USS, Adamson, Lawo, and avshop.ca.
All right. So the next question here is, how often should audio engineers get an audiogram of their ears, and how should they consider these findings into their workflow? Would you recommend applying DSP in their monitoring? Also, there may be other, Jeremy mentioned other methods of getting a visual representation of how you hear. So if you can get your point of view on that.
Fletcher Muntz in 1933 did some amazing work, and they inform our current view on this. When we do a hearing test, and there's nothing wrong with getting a hearing test once a year. I see routinely all my music people and from the artists about once a year, and just keep tabs on them. Maybe it's more to bring them up on what's new in the field, such as chemical earmuffs, rather than to do a hearing test. Hearing loss is a very, very slow, gradual process. And it's not something you might see even from year to year, but every 5 or every 10 years, you might see a difference. So it's not going to make a major difference. If you do detect a major difference quickly, it's not to do with the loud music. It's something else, and you should see your doctor, your audiologist immediately. Don't put it off. There are incidences of sudden hearing loss, and that has nothing to do with noise. It's something else. But as far as getting a hearing test once a year is very reasonable. But Fletcher Munson tells us to a certain extent that a hearing test or an audiogram is a lie. And the reason it's a lie is because different inputs or different sounds we hear differently. So, for example, an audiogram is done where you press a button or put your hand up every time you hear a beat, even if it's very, very soft. So we're finding the softest sound or the zero phone curve for Fletcher Munson. And we calibrate our audiometers such that under earphones, 7 dB, minimal audible pressure at 1,000 hertz is 0 dB, 11.5 dB at this is 0 dB. So our audiometer is calibrated in a scale called HL, or hearing level, which is different degrees of sound pressure level. But we know that a straight line in that sense on an audiogram will be normal hearing based on 20, 30,000 young adults. And there might be some variation. But that's the softest sound that you could hear. So let's say somebody has a little bit of a hearing loss on their audiogram, a deviation from normal. I've asked you to put your hand up or press a button, even for the very, very soft sound. If I was to do that same experiment on you, to do a hearing test, to find what sound is average or comfortable, and I did that across the frequency. Or I did an experiment where I find, okay, put your hand up and push a button every time the sound gets almost too loud. Any louder would just be too loud. Your tolerance level. Well, it turns out, and Fletcher Munson has pointed this out in 1933, that at soft levels, what you might see is a bit of a hearing loss on an audiogram. At louder levels, where you're, let's say, talking a little bit louder than speech or maybe even speech, it's a flat loss. That is a flat hearing. That is, there's no measurable hearing loss. And your pain thresholds, if you want to go that loud, there's no loss. So I wouldn't use any DSP to correct an audiogram unless the audiogram is fairly significant. Even up to 40 or 50 dB loss, yes, for very soft sounds, you might need a little bit of a boost there, but average conversational speech or the levels of music are at a high enough level such that that audiogram is not telling a true picture to you. You can hear the sounds as soft as a 10-year-old kid, but we don't walk around listening to very soft sounds. Leaves rustling on occasion. But we're interested in speech and music, which is at a supra threshold or louder level. So if somebody comes in, gives you a hearing test, and you say, oh, golly, I have a 40 decibel hearing loss at 4,000 hertz, the top note of the keyboard, which is fairly common. Don't do anything. Don't use any DSP. Don't boost up the gain at 4,000 hertz, because let your auditory system and the lessons of Fletcher Munson inform you that, okay, that's too bad, and just go on with your life. If for those people that do have a more significant loss and they're concerned maybe they can't hear the high end as well as they should, this is the trick you should do. Instead of mixing at, let's say, 70 decibels, try mixing at 80 decibels, a little bit louder than you normally would. And that way your auditory system will flatten out and you know the balance between the lows and highs. And then once you've set your equalization, then reduce the level to 70 or 60 or the level that I'm talking right now, or whatever monitoring level you want to do. You're not sure? Turn up the volume, check the equalizations, and turn it back down again. Cool. Neat, eh?
Cool. Thank you. Thank you. Very, very similar, kind of a similar perspective from Jeremy's. So next question is, the way the human brain adapts to its environment is amazing. Can you provide some information about how the brain readjusts itself to changes caused by damage or even an accident?
Accident will do that one a little bit different. Whenever we go to a rock concert or whenever we have a feedback squeal in our ear, if I was to measure hearing just before and just after, there is a temporary loss of the sensitivity, and that usually resolves after 16 to 18 hours. The tinnitus or ringing ears may extend a little longer, but usually it's not something we need to worry about too much. In fact, let me take a step back. I actually developed an app at the Musicians Clinics of Canada called the Temporary Threshold Shift app, or specifically both on Android and iPhone. You can get it for free. It's now free. It's called Temporary Hearing Loss Test. And the way it works is very simple. You use it on your phone, whether you use earphones or not with the phone, as long as you're consistent with the before and after. Let's say you use earphones. You press the button and it emits a sound at 6,000 hertz, the G just above the top end of the piano keyboard, a frequency that we frequently get a hearing loss in. And you, with your finger on the screen, reduce the volume until it's just barely audible and your threshold. Any softer, you won't hear it. And that's your threshold of hearing in this environment. Then you go and do your gig or whatever, and then you do it a second time, and you hit a button that says measure hearing again. And you do the very same thing. And because it's a difference measure, you don't have to worry about calibration, which is the difference between two things. But then again, you hit the button, and it gives you a green screen if it's less than about 5 or 6 decibels, orange or amber warning screen at up to 15 decibels of temporary hearing loss, and if it's more than 15, it turns red. But if you don't see a measurable type of loss, that is green screen, don't worry about it. Then it doesn't matter what the level is. So if there's no temporary hearing loss, there won't be any permanent hearing loss. Now, to get back to your question, though, how does the brain adapt to it? So that's the temporary one. There are permanent ones, and we can have a very, very loud feedback squeal or explosion, pyrotechnics that sometimes occurs, that can, as a single insult, create a hearing loss. And unlike music exposure, which is long-term, which almost exclusively exists around the top end of the piano keyboard, between 3,000 and 6,000 hertz at the top end of the piano keyboard, that is a bass player and a piccolo player will have identical hearing if it was from their own instrument. Acoustic trauma, if it's from a one-time insult, will usually be at the frequency of insult. So if the explosion has a peak at 1,500 hertz, you'll have a dip in your hearing at 1,500 hertz. So that's a little bit different. The way the nerve endings, though, try to adapt is that they get a little bit swollen up physiologically, and then after a while they start to relax a little bit. There's two views on this. One is that I told you there's 13 to 15,000 nerve endings. Turns out we only need about 10% of them. We can lose 90% of the nerve endings, 90% of the microphones in the ear, and still have a normal hearing test, normal audiogram. It's just mind-blowing. And that's how cochlear implants work. Cochlear implants go in there with like 18 or 20 different electrodes, and not 18,000 or 20,000, just 18 or 20 of them in different frequency place regions. And these people can hear fairly well, almost, for speech anyway, almost as good as normal hearing people. Music falls short because cochlear implants cannot transduce the lower frequencies very well. But the cochlear is quite amazing. What happens, though, is that if you have a damage to these nerve endings, it doesn't stop there. It goes up the stream, nerves into different auditory pathways, into different centers. It turns out that nerve endings, if they don't have the input that's required, will atrophy, will die. They can regrow, not those same ones. Once they're dead, they're dead. But we're talking about trillions of nerve endings in the brain, and with a good portion of them being in very important areas like hearing and also the auditory and visual cortices. But you can actually have what's called neuroplasticity. So plastic meaning regrowing. And neuroplasticity can occur, and it does occur quite naturally. There are auditory training classes any music student takes in school, and many audio engineers take in their training. And if I was to actually do a scan of their brain before the classes and a scan of the brain after the classes, there would be a small but measurable difference in function. So as we learn new things, new neurons and new neural connections are made. And so it's not just a one-way thing. The body always wants to get back and regrow itself. Neuroplasticity is an entire talk or 10 into itself. So at this point, as long as you know the word neuroplasticity and type that in, I'm sure, like the Mayo Clinic, for example, or Harvard has done a lot of work with Sharon Kujawa in her lab. You type in Sharon Kujawa, 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 and type in her labs with Charlie Lieberman, those two. They've done some amazing work on neural regrowth or plasticity or reorganization.
That's very interesting. I'm super into neuroscience and how our brain adapts to situations. So that was a question that I was looking forward.
For more information on the Toronto section of the Audio Engineering Society, go to torontoaes.org. The Toronto AES is sponsored by Solotech, Gear Audio, Sono Technique, Bell Media, YSL Pro, Electrosonics Canada, BRTB, Global USS, Adamson, Lawo, and avshop.ca.
So, I'm a 30-year-old audio engineer, and I was wondering how I can extend the length of my career and and extend my ability to hear properly. And if there are any considerations I should keep other than the obvious ones, don't be exposed to loud noises over long periods of time and all that. Are there any diets or lifestyles that contribute to hearing health?
Before I approach diet and different foods, I don't want to leave basic good ear care. There are, and since 1988, have been a form of hearing protection, an earplug called the ER15. And this was a brainchild of Elmer Carlson. I threw a little blank there. And one of his colleagues, when he left the place that Elmer Carlson was working in the 80s, called Knowles Electronics, went over and started a new company, and his name is Reed Killian. And the company's name is called Etymodic Research. And they have also a wonderful website with a wealth of publications. If you type in ETYMOTIC, Etymotic, true to the ear, a new Latin word.com, it will take you to that site. And hence the name of the earplug is ER for Etymotic Research. And the innovation that was commercialized finally in 1988 allows the hearing protection to be truly flat, between about 63 hertz to about 16,000 hertz. Normally, you plug your ears, you sound awful because of the laws of physics. The low end is only attenuated a little bit. The higher frequency is quite a bit, and you lose the natural resonator chamber of the ear canal. And so you've lost the harmonic structure on the right-hand side of the piano keyboard. The earplugs, the ER15s, put this back. And 15 stands for decibels. And while that may not sound like a lot, it is a lot, because every 3 decibel reduction, and remember what I told you before about humans, we're very insensitive to changes of loudness or intensity. But if we can drop the sound level in our environment by a mere 3 decibels, something that's not quite noticeable, especially if it's a complex sound, like music or speech, we can be exposed twice as long before any damage occurs. That is, it's 1/2 of our damage, or if we drop it 3 dB, or an increase is double our damage. So let's do some math. A 3 decibel reduction, barely detectable, means we can be exposed twice as long. A 6 decibel reduction, 4 times as long. An 9 9 decibel reduction, 8 times as long. We're great parties. I also do weddings. I can really get up there. 12 decibels down, 16 times as long. 15 decibels down, which is not a lot, is 32 times as long. That means a musician or audio engineer can be exposed 32 times as long before the same damage occurs with the ER15 earplug. Or if you're using earphones in a well-controlled environment and you're happy with equalization, drop the level by about 10 or 15 decibels, and that would be a great savings. It's just amazing how good you could have it. There are other things. We don't just do music. We don't just do sound engineering. We go outside on a motorcycle. We mow our lawn. We go past construction sites. We're on motorboats. We go water skiing. We do things that are noisy and light. We listen to our iPods or your MP3 players out in the street. Nothing wrong with any of that. But speaking about iPods or MP3 players, this came out of the work of Brian Kligor. Brian found in his doctorate something called the 80-90 rule. 80% volume for 90 minutes a day. That gives you 50%, one half of your daily dose of noise or music exposure. 80-90 rule. So you're listening to it for 80% volume, maybe not more than an hour and a half a day. It does depend on which earphone you use. You did fine though. But if your favorite song comes on, turn up the volume, full blast, enjoy it thoroughly, just turn it back down to a more reasonable level after. So moderation, I think, is a clue. If you are at a gig on Friday night, don't mow your lawn on Saturday. Get someone else to do it for you, or maybe put it off until Sunday. Wear hearing protection, such as the ER15, whenever you can. The ER15 is a molded size, so that people would see me clinically, I take an impression, send it to a lab, and about a week later, they'd actually get them. They're looking at about $300 a pair, Canadian. And that sounds like a lot, but you probably, I got my pair in 1992. I still have them, so it's a one-time expenditure. There is a one-size-fits-all form of the ER15. They call it the ER20XS, the two letters X and S, and that kind of fits into your ear. It's about $10 or $12. You can get them from etymodic.com. Many music stores also carry them. As far as any medications are concerned, about half the medications that are prescribed to you by a physician or a primary care physician would be toxic to the ear. That is, it has ringing as side effect. Now, that usually is a higher dose. It usually would be worse if you had kidney problems, for example, because the kidney gets rid of the things from your body. And if you have kidney problems, even aspirin can be toxic to your ear at higher levels. And many people that have arthritis may take ASA or aspirin derivatives and some NSAID. That can be toxic to the ear. So if you are taking higher levels of aspirin and or if you have any kidney dysfunction, you may want to talk to your doctor about alternative medications that perhaps are less toxic to the ear. Diabetes is a biggie. I remember when I first graduated from school, I was at a health fair, and the person next to me was from the Canadian Diabetes Association. And I said, so hearing loss and diabetes are connected. He said, no, they were wrong and I was right. But what was not known back in the 80s is now well known. In fact, one of the first questions we ask whenever we see someone clinically is, do you have diabetes? Because that restricts blood flow through your whole body, not just your hands or your eyes, but your ears as well. And people with diabetes can find some difficulties. Smoking. Smoking is not a big one, but it is a small mitigating factor. There have been I can send you this article if you want. Every about 15 years in the United States, they do this massive, large epidemiological study, not just for hearing, but for everything. And they look at the characteristics of 19-year-olds and 25-year-olds. And the articles are written blah, blah, blah about 19 to 25-year-olds. And there's one in particular by John Naparco and his colleagues. And it has a graph showing those that have hearing loss as a 20-year-old kid that smoke versus don't smoke. And indeed, even at age 20, you can see there's 4 or 5 decibel reduction in hearing for the smokers versus the non-smokers. Not 20 or 30, but it's a little bit. But if you're smoking as a 20-year-old, then you get to 30, then you get to 40, then you get to 50, and you're still smoking, well, sure, I think it's much more important not to smoke for cancer reasons. The fact that you probably smell bad than hearing, but that is one of many factors. I would say that if you are going to have any recreational pharmaceuticals, be careful. We don't really know some of the effects. We know that even marijuana at high levels can be toxic. The CBD element within marijuana, there's no evidence that is toxic, but marijuana sometimes comes with other stuff in it other than CBD. So be careful about that. But there's no downside that we know of so far with cannabinoids, if it's just that we're looking at. Alcohol, no known side effects, but there are other side effects on your kidney, your liver, and everything else that certainly don't drive. But from a hearing perspective, it's not a big issue. And the last thing I want to say on this is that in October of 2018, I guest edited a special issue of a magazine that's free called Hearing Review. And you can get it by hearingreview.com. Click on it. Go to October of 2018, so about a year and a bit ago, 2 years and a bit ago. And it was essentially entitled, "What Can We Do to Extend a Musician's Playing Career?" And I got 8 to 10 musicians from around North America that already had a very significant hearing loss. Not all music related. Sometimes it was congenital, sometimes other reasons, sometimes unknown. But these were currently functioning, successful composers and musicians, and they just wrote at length about how they could hear and how they can extend their career for another 10, 15, 20 years. And what one person says is different than what another person said. And so there's all these little strategies. Sometimes it were devices, sometimes it was ear training, but it's worthwhile reading that if you have some time.
Thank you so much. I have one question, one last one, and it's related to COVID. Have you read any evidence of long-term effects for people who got COVID in their hearing?
Good question. It's too early to tell. There was a large Israeli study about a month ago that said no. There was another study that said yes. There's going to be a study published on March 4th in a magazine called CanadianAudiologist.ca. I'm the editor-in-chief. I guess I should have said that in my bio. But it's one word, CanadianAudiologist.ca. That's the official publication of the Canadian Academy of Audiology. And Bob DeSogra has written an article about COVID and earwax and some of the elements, and he refers back to some of the other earlier research with COVID. There's no known relationship other than perhaps people with COVID being an upper respiratory illness are getting upper respiratory diseases that affect their hearing as we all would be affected if we had a bad cold or we had a bad flu. Something much more common with children than for adults, but we're getting it too. But we've all had colds and flus where ears get all stuffed up because of eustachian tube dysfunction. That's discussed in chapter 1 of Hear the Music if you want to see that book. And we do know that can be a factor, but that's a temporary factor. You may need to see your primary care physician for antibiotics if indeed it is bacterial, or other ways of resolving that problem. Sometimes it just resolves on its own. In fact, more often than not, it resolves on its own. So we do know that the incidence of middle ear disorders like ear infections is much more prevalent with any flu, COVID being no exception, than outside of flu season. Thankfully, at least because of our improved intelligence of staying away from people, not being too close, wash your hands, the incidence of flu is down this time of year. Which is if there's anything positive about COVID, we get, which there isn't, which we do know the incidence of flu is way down. So, at this time of year, wash your hands, do all the common normal things you do to avoid flus. But COVID itself, other than creating some isolation, which can't be understated, I can't tell you how many more musicians and sound engineers I've seen just in the last 3 or 4 months where tinnitus or ringing in the ears that was not bothersome now all of a sudden is bothersome to them. And their hearing hasn't changed, and maybe their tinnitus hasn't changed, but their bothersomeness, or how tinnitus bothers them, has really changed. And a lot of it's related to stress. So when you're isolated, do your exercises, do your mindfulness training, try to communicate with your friends, Zoom or otherwise, as much as you can, or out on the street, physically distant from each other. Do what cranks your chain. Everyone's different. Me, to reduce my stress, I do karate, nothing like beating up kids. I watch 1940s movies. Everyone has their own little chain they have to crank to decrease the stress. But don't dismiss stress, and don't be a macho person saying stress won't affect me. Yeah, it will. It may not overtly, but it will eventually get you. Stress still is the big killer. So all I can suggest to you and leave you with is do whatever it takes to decrease your stress. Nothing wrong with CBD. If you want to get stoned occasionally, don't drive a car with it. But there are no side effects that are negative for it. So whatever it takes, a little bit of red wine, a glass a day, not 5 glasses a day. So whatever it does, do some push-ups. Walk up the flight of stairs rather than take the elevator. Do these things to get your heart rate going. Cool.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your insight. It's really, it's a very holistic approach, and I love holistic approaches. I think everything's interconnected, and your perspective on the effects of stress is just amazing, because I've always been concerned about that. And thank you so much for taking your time.
Thank you for attending tonight's presentation of the Toronto Audio Engineering Society. The Toronto Audio Engineering Society unites engineers socially. Within our allied arts, we collect, collate, and disseminate scientific knowledge that furthers all fields of audio engineering. The AES aims to empower people of all ages through participation in healthy, safe, open community presentations. Learn about audio engineering through events, presentations, networking, and mentorship. Visit www.torontoaes.org to join today.
All right, so our next guest for tonight is Braden Maxwell, and this one will not be an interview. It's going to be a presentation, a very, very informative presentation that Braden has prepared for us. Thank you so much, Braden, for sending that over, and I hope everybody enjoys it. Here we go.
Good evening. My name is Braden Maxwell, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Eastman School of Music at the University of Rochester. I want to send virtual greetings to everyone who is part of the Toronto chapter of the AES. Thanks so much for inviting me to talk about hearing. Today I'm going to focus on some things our lab has been studying recently involving the brain's internal picture or representation of musical timbre. We think that by simulating what happens to musical sound on the inside of the brain, we can help in the long-term effort to make music perception better for people with hearing aids. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of the auditory system. You're probably familiar with the outer ear, middle ear, and inner ear, where the cochlea is. Beyond that, we like to think about the auditory system as a series of bus stops, or a series of stages where each stage has slightly different properties and performs a slightly different function. So signals are carried from the cochlea to the brain by the auditory nerve, and those signals pass through several other areas and then arrive at the midbrain, and they go from there up to the cortex. And the auditory nerve and the midbrain, I've emphasized these two bus stops because we have computational models that simulate how the neurons work in those two places. And so those are kind of the two locations that I'm going to emphasize in this presentation. All right, so another important background concept is the idea of a tonotopic axis. So each stop along the auditory pathway has, generally speaking, what we call a tonotopic axis. This is an axis that kind of goes from neurons that respond to low frequencies to neurons that respond to high frequencies. And in some places in the brain, this axis physically exists. So there are, if you start at a low frequency, a neuron that responds to low frequencies and kind of go in one direction, the neurons will gradually increase their in the frequency that they respond to. But regardless, this is just kind of a useful way of thinking about each place in the brain, that it has its own tonotopic axis. I also want to give a little bit of background on timbre, although I know many of you listening to this are very familiar with this concept. So one of the things that particularly interests us about timbre is the idea that there are multiple acoustic factors that influence it. And three of these are the spectral centroid, something called spectral irregularity, and spectral and temporal modulation. And one thing most of the project I'm going to talk about today is focused on the spectral centroid and the perception of brightness that's associated with it. But we're going to talk a little bit about spectral irregularity and modulation as well. So as I said, spectral centroid is associated with brightness, and typically sounds that are brighter have a higher spectral centroid, which means that they have more energy kind of at higher frequencies in their spectrum. Sounds with a lower spectral centroid are usually considered less bright, and they have most of their energy at lower frequencies. So you can see this bassoon spectrum has more energy at low frequencies. Trumpet spectrum has more energy at high frequencies. Spectral irregularity has to do with the jaggedness of the spectrum. So you can see this trumpet spectrum has a very smooth spectral envelope, but this clarinet spectrum is very irregular, or it has some harmonics that are next to other harmonics that differ greatly in their magnitude. So these are a couple of components of timbre. The first step toward understanding our lab's specific work is to understand what happens to spectral peaks in the auditory system. And the simplest way to start understanding these is to look at a stimulus that only has one spectral peak, like this stimulus from a 2014 paper by Emily Allen and Andrew Oxenham. I'll play the stimulus for you real quick. One thing that you notice immediately when you start working with these models of the inside of the brain, of the auditory system, is that there's nothing quite like the spectrum in the first part of the auditory system. In fact, the closest we really get to a spectrum is represented in the brain is the overall activity of the of auditory nerve fibers across this tonotopic axis. But you can see that even though this is the closest thing to a spectrum, it's pretty vague and kind of broad and nonspecific. And we've actually shown in previous work that this representation is unlikely to form a good kind of neural basis for brightness perception. One reason why this is so broad is that at the sound levels where we listen to music, which are generally 60, 70, 80 dBSPL, each auditory nerve fiber is not very selected in terms of the frequencies that it responds to. So over here on the right-hand side, there's an experiment where they had one auditory nerve fiber, and they were kind of measuring its activity. So its activity is on the y-axis. And they measured that activity in response to a bunch of different sine tones. So they played sine tones with different frequencies on the x-axis. And you can see that when they were playing the sine tones at very low levels, like 38 dBSPL, the auditory nerve only responded to a narrow range of frequencies. But when they played them at 70 dBSPL, this auditory nerve fiber that we would think of as, having a tonotopic frequency perhaps of 1100 hertz also responded to sine tones at 600 hertz. So at the high sound levels we use for music, the auditory nerve fibers respond to a wide range of sound frequencies, and we get a kind of blurry representation like this. So one of our first questions is, how does that get more specific? The kind of summary of these next few slides is that even though the overall activity of the auditory nerve across the tonotopic axis is very vague, there are very precise differences across the tonotopic axis in more short-term timing patterns of the neural activity. And you can see that these timing patterns are shown in this figure here. So right at the spectral peak, we think of this auditory nerve activity as kind of flat, because it's responding, the activity is kind of going up and down over time at the tonotopic frequency, but there's no envelope to the neural activity over time. Whereas at other locations below the spectral peak or above the spectral peak, there's kind of an envelope to the neural activity over time. And that envelope is an example of something we call a kind of a class of temporal phenomena that we call neural fluctuations. Neural fluctuations range between about 10 hertz and 200 hertz. So they're kind of, they can be much faster than the types of temporal modulations that are usually considered important in speech. But they're generally much slower than the tonotopic frequency of the neuron that's carrying them. As you can see here, they're kind of superimposed. So they're kind of like amplitude modulation, but they're inside the brain. So this more precise encoding of where the spectral peak is through the difference in fluctuations across the tonotopic axis is interpreted by the midbrain. And that's because the midbrain is very sensitive to fluctuations. So this particular type of midbrain neuron will turn off when it receives a fluctuating input, but it will turn on when it receives both energy and a flat input. So you can see that through these kind of timing patterns, we get a much more precise encoding of the spectral peak in the midbrain overall activity across the tonotopic axis than we got previously in this auditory nerve activity across the tonotopic axis.
For more information on the Toronto section of the Audio Engineering Society, go to torontoaes.org. The Toronto AES is sponsored by Solotech, Gear Audio, Sonotechnique, Bell Media, YSL Pro, Electrosonics Canada, BRTB, Global USS, Adamson, Lawo, and avshop.ca.
So that's how a single peak is kind of sharpened. And we've observed that phenomenon in several ways in our research. But one thing we're particularly interested in is what happens when there are multiple spectral peaks. This violin spectrum shows an example of this. So we have two low frequency harmonics that kind of stand out. They're kind of local spectral peaks. And then there are also some local spectral peaks at high frequencies. The auditory nerve overall activity is very kind of vague, just like in the last example. But in the midbrain, we see these four peaks pretty clearly represented. One kind of unique feature of these simulations is, and these midbrain properties, is that this timbre representation actually gets a little bit better when you add a small amount of ambient noise. So in this case, green and dark gray curves correspond to the midbrain model response with a little bit of background noise. And the light gray curve corresponds to the response without any background noise. So so basically adding noise is actually enhancing these responses. And we think that's probably because these neural mechanisms are very accustomed to working in imperfect auditory environments where there is background noise. And the system kind of uses that to its advantage. So this is kind of an interesting, something that we're thinking about as an interesting finding. You might also notice that even though this higher peak, for example, 4,000, is much lower magnitude in the spectrum than this lower peak, their midbrain the midbrain kind of makes them equal. And so you can think about this midbrain representation as emphasizing spectral peaks, kind of like, and kind of, you can almost think about it like an equalization process, where this picture of the timbre in the midbrain kind of emphasizes certain features and de-emphasizes others. And so we think that's kind of interesting as well. And that suggests a connection potentially between spectral irregularity, or these kind of local peaks, jagged places in the spectrum, and other aspects of timbre, for example, brightness. So if we calculate a center of mass of this early auditory representation, we can see that certain parts of, like I said, certain parts of the sound are emphasized more than others. And in this way, if we were to calculate a centroid based on this representation, we would see that those peaks would play a big role in the brightness of the sound. And we are interested at this point at proposing that that's exactly what's going on. We've done some other research that I won't present here that discusses or kind of shows that this midbrain model representation can explain some psychophysical results relating to brightness. Here, I'd just like to talk about the commonly known kind of organization of different instrument timbres from less bright to more bright. Generally, we think about instruments like vibraphone and clarinet, French horn as being less bright, and things like trumpet or oboe, violin as being brighter. And if we derive an estimate of brightness from our midbrain model for these instrument sounds, and then kind of look at that relative brightness, it does what we would expect. So that's the data up here on the left. So vibraphone, horn, clarinet have lower midbrain centroids, and oboe, trumpet, and violin have kind of higher centroids. Like I said, this matches what we generally observe in humans. This data is from McAdams, 2019. And piano and guitar are kind of in the middle. So those are our primary results. But I'd also like to talk about another aspect of this work, which is that you can try it yourself from home. So we have an open science framework site. If you go to this link, we're working on making it possible to run these simulations without any computational background at all. Right now, I'm going to talk about the version of this simulation software that you can use if you are familiar with MATLAB. And I have kind of one example here. At this link, you can download something called UR-EAR, which stands for University of Rochester Envisioning Auditory Responses. And if you open that folder in MATLAB, then you'll see a bunch of different functions. You can go down to the command line and just type in the name of the our main function, which is called UR Ear 2020B timbre. If you type that in, this GUI will come up, and the GUI's default setting is to simulate neural responses to a WAV file. This will work for any WAV file that you add to that folder. In this case, we're going to look at a Soon sample. And you can just leave all the other settings here where they are. That should be suitable for a large range of instrument samples. You hit run. It'll take a while for the simulation to occur, but we're going to skip over some of that, and you'll get a result that looks like this. So the first type of result is a waveform. On top of that waveform, you can see these bars that indicate an analysis window. That's the time span over which you're going to observe the neural response. And you can mess around with that. You can change that here. We're going to change it so that it starts at the beginning of the sample. In addition to this waveform, we have a spectrogram here. We have a spectrum of the stimulus. There are some depictions of the neurons responding, model neurons responding over time that I won't get into in too much detail. And then there's these average kind of activity plots that I've talked about a little bit before. And those are really useful. I think this midbrain one, it says IC for inferior colliculus, which is the same thing as the midbrain. This midbrain one is possibly the most useful, and you can kind of see in this bassoon example that several of the spectral peaks are represented here, just like in the violin that we discussed. We're also working on a couple of other things that aren't on the website yet, but hoping to be up there soon. This is an example of some code that will allow you to look at a neural simulation in real time aligned with a musical example. The red arrow is going to point toward high frequency information, high frequency responses from the midbrain that are kind of the easiest thing to follow and the easiest thing to line up with the music. So much for those. And so that's an example of just some more software that's hopefully will be available soon. And with that, I'd like to conclude this presentation. Thanks so much for having me. There are a couple of conclusions I'd like to emphasize. First, there are potentially fundamental neural relationships between timbral brightness, temporal modulation, and spectral irregularity. Second, spectral peaks may be more important for neural representations of timbral brightness than other parts of the spectrum. And finally, preserving this peak sharpening process that I discussed with the neural fluctuations may be essential to making hearing aids better for timbre perception. I'd also like to ask this crowd in particular a couple of audio engineering related questions. First, we're interested to hear any and all perspectives on how spectral peaks are treated in music production. So we're learning a lot about spectral peaks from the neural angle, but we'd like to connect that with your perspectives on these issues. Also, our lab would be interested to simulate neural responses for samples of recordings before and after editing, especially examples where two timbres are made more easily distinguishable from one another during that process. So if you have any examples from your work that you'd be willing to share, feel free to send them along. You can send responses to these questions to my email, which is right here. And thanks again for listening.
Thank you for attending tonight's presentation of the Toronto Audio Engineering Society. The Toronto Audio Engineering Society unites engineers socially. Within our allied arts, we collect, collate, and disseminate scientific knowledge that furthers all fields of audio engineering. The AES aims to empower people of all ages through participation in healthy, safe, open community presentations. Learn about audio engineering through events, presentations, networking, and mentorship. Visit www.torontoaes.org to join today.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. I'm Steve Armstrong. I've had fun talking to you guys. In fact, I think it was last January is probably one of the last live AES meetings before the COVID thing kicked in. But we talked a lot about hearing aids and that, but the focus tonight's a little bit different. As you can probably see on the screen, the idea is, so you've listened to Marshall Chasin, you've gotten your audiogram, and what are you going to do with that useful information? So playing around with a couple ideas here as an engineering guy. I know we've talked about hearing aid signal processing before, but thought it'd be kind of fun to see where this goes. So without any further ado, you guys are going to get tired of looking at my smiling face, and it's probably going to get in the way of some of the graphics. So let's make that go away for right now. I have to say, this first time using OBS for recording, so I'm going to be kind of curious how that all works out. So let's see how it goes. So, topic is, how do we turn audiograms into something useful for monitoring? And as I said, a lot of my background has been hearing aid space, where we have microphones, and we have amplifiers, and we have little speakers that we put in your ears. But so there's a wealth of knowledge that comes from that space that we might be able to apply here. So let's suppose you have been good. You've gone off and you've had your hearing tested. You undoubtedly met a nice audiologist, perhaps somebody who sat you down in a booth and stuck some insert earphones into you, or maybe they just used the headphones. Either way, they hooked it up to an audiometer. And going through that testing, the output of that is something like the graphic over on the right-hand side here. It's called the audiogram. And it's upside down. It's, the worse the hearing loss, the lower you are down on the scale. And normal hearing is sort of that 0 dB line. That's where you'd love to be, although truthfully, anything less than 20 dB loss is considered normal clinically. So, because there is variations. Of course, across the x-axis, we're looking at frequency, but let's say you've taken that. So what are you going to do with that? Well, to start our journey, let's go back a little bit and look at equal loudness contours. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of these things. They've been studied for quite a while, but the idea is that each one of these lines represents the sound level that's necessary to be judged equally loud as some other sound that's on that line. And specifically, we're talking pure tones, so sine waves. So imagine down at 1 kilohertz, you could hear the average individual without any hearing impairment would have a threshold of hearing down here around a little over 5 dB SPL, but that's called audiometric 0. But if you take that same individual and you go down to 100 hertz, now you see that they need about 35 dB SPL just to tickle the neurons, just to get that sensation of sound going. And as we go down lower in frequency, it gets progressively higher. So one of the things that we find is that the threshold of hearing, even for people without hearing difficulties, is not flat with frequency. And as we go up with sound level, each one of these curves represents another isophon line, another iso perception line, so equal loudness contour. So as we go up in level, one of the things that happens is our hearing losses tend to, or our hearing sensitivity, I should say, tends to flatten out. And for those who like to geek out, the bottommost curve is called the minimum audible field, and field referring to you use speakers to test this. If you're using headphones, the curves look a little bit different because then you'd be talking about minimum audible pressure, and that pressure would be the sound pressure at your eardrum. But we're going to talk about speakers because everybody's a little bit more familiar with that. So if you took your audiogram and you happen to measure like this red line over here shows, where you've got Down at low frequencies, fairly normal hearing, but then it progressively gets higher, becoming a 50 dB loss by the time you're up to, certainly 4 kilohertz. Well, you can view that as causing a shift in your equal loudness contours. And I said the audiogram looks flat, but in reality, remember, it's nothing more than this lowest sensitivity curve. So audiology and hearing scientists, we like to take the lowest threshold of hearing curve, which is not flat, and make it flat. So all hearing losses are relative to something that's not flat to begin with. So what you see here is that the threshold curve has been pushed up. The other curves all have been sort of squished together. But let's take this a little bit further and try looking at what we're going to see from those curves. So what I want to do here on the next curve is let me throw away half those curves just to help clarify that. So all we did was take away half the loudness contours, and let's start digging into each one of these pairs one at a time. So for very soft sounds, it's this pair of red lines. So the bottom thin line would be your normal hearing colleague, and that thicker red line happens to be the contour that you have based on your threshold shifting. So a reasonable sort of strategy is, hey, I want to get that thick line down to the thin line. Clearly, I need some amplification. And I need amplification. And with the right amount of amplification, I might get that back to where it was when I was much younger. Now we move up to the next level of sounds, and things are sitting at the a little bit louder. Same pair of lines, we bring those down for soft sounds. We need gain to bring that down, and we can progress all of our way up through normal sound levels, or sort of 60, 65 dB type things. Speech, we need a little bit of amplification, but notice as we're going up, we need less and less amplification. In fact, for the loudest sounds, we need no amplification at all. So just to back that up, let's do that one more time. I'll do it a little quicker this time. So we started off here, brought that down, things got louder, we needed less gain, progressively less gain, until we got up to the loudest sounds, and we need no gain at all. So expressed another way, we need a level and frequency dependent amount of amplification, because we don't need amplification down at the low frequencies for this audiogram. We need it for the higher frequencies. So reasonable amplification goals might look like what's shown here in the graph, where we need for quieter sounds or quiet environments in the case of hearing aids, because their microphones are sensing the environmental sounds. They need a high frequency boost for that particular audiogram, but as things get louder, you don't actually need any gain. You actually acoustically want these hearing aids to pop out of your ear, and that's the sort of thing we also want to achieve even when we're doing monitoring. So the hearing aid goals is we want to make quiet sounds audible, we want to make loud sounds loud but comfortable, so we don't want to over amplify those, and as much as possible we try to avoid distortion. So guess what? That sounds like a lot of things that'd be good to do for the challenge of monitoring at home now that we're using headphones and trying to keep things quieter. So in the hearing aid space, we would take the microphone signal, run it through a band split filter for that loss, and run compression in the high frequencies, the low frequencies, add those two together, pump it out through the receiver to your ear canal. And I can tell you that if you want to attempt this, our old friend Linkwitz-Riley crossover networks, found in a lot of speakers and that, makes a really good circuit for doing this. In fact, don't go crazy in terms of the roll-off rate. You just want a mild 12 dB per octave. And the thing that's nice about a Linkwitz-Riley, as many of you will know, is that the phase relationship between these two outputs are perfectly in sync. And that says that after we do the compression, we can add those back together with no fear of bad artifacts coming from phase. So there's one strategy. In fact, what I want to do is show you a little bit more of an example. I've got a couple pieces of software here to help illustrate things. So, kind of spoiler alert, I left it set up here. So we want to start off. Our goal of amplification here is we want to split the band here, and although this is really a 3-channel system, I'm just going to focus on the highest frequency. So let's do the crossover here. So like a good crossover network, we can adjust the crossover frequency. This does implement a Linkwitz-Riley, so the crossover points are 6 dB down. But what we really want from amplification is we want, for quieter sounds, we need to amplify those sounds like that. And we know that for loud sounds, we don't want any amplification at all. So you could potentially think about just using a high-frequency shelving filter to do this. And to some degree, that can work. And we'll talk a little bit about what sort of gains you should shoot for. But the whole real goal here is, in the hearing aid space, we try to make this gain change automatically in response to the sound level coming in. Well, that's not really a lot different than what our goal, a reasonable goal here is, that in some ways we'd like to give you a signal processing strategy to put on the way out to the headphones that you're doing all your monitoring with. So you could do that with just a little bit of EQ. You might have a multi-band compressor at your disposal, in which case you'd look at doing that in high frequencies for this particular loss. If you did have some low frequency loss, so you could also compensate for that by providing a little gain for quiet sounds. But I brought this piece of software up just to show you the idea. Split them, separate the processing tasks into two, and away you go. Now I want to pull up a different tool that I've got here. This is one that I wrote for teaching about how hearing aid compression works. But I think it's applicable equally to what we're talking about here today. So centermost is the input versus output curve. And if we were doing hearing aids, we'd worry about input SPL versus output SPL. But because we're talking about digital audio workstations or mixing consoles, really we want to think about dB full scale, dBFS. So where it says 100, imagine plugging in a 0, and down where it says 0, make that 100 dBFS, and these scales will sort of work out. So what we would typically do, and we know that anything on this diagonal line going through 0, 0, that's our so-called unity gain case. But now what we've said is, hey, we want to have some gain to the system. And just for reference here, the graph below here is going to plot the gain versus input. So the gain is nothing more than, well, let's just add some gain here. I'm going to add 20 dB a gain. So I'm pushing this I/O curve up 20 dB, and the plot below shows 20 dB a gain. The red here indicates clipping, which we don't want to do in a hearing aid, and we certainly don't want to do for a monitoring system. So what you would typically do, though, then is you're going to want to have a compression ratio added in. And certainly much of the compression, when we think of compression in the context of audio engineering and the kinds of things most of you guys are involved in, we're used to compression that as we increase the compression ratio, we're reducing the gain for loud sounds. And yeah, we might have some makeup gain like this, still pull down the compression ratio. But the kinds of things that we need to do for compensating for hearing loss is, yeah, that would provide gain, but it's not going to compensate. It's not really going to give us that nice level dependency. What we really want to do is pull our threshold down as low as you can go, perhaps down to equivalent to 30, 40 dB SPL, and then we can back off the compression. So now what I've got is I'm providing 20 dB a gain up to my low knee point, and then a fairly mild compression. And by the time you get up to the equivalent of 90 dB, you want to be back to unity gain, because as our previous graph showed, for many individuals, even with a hearing loss, by the time you get to louder sounds, your hearing is as normal as it is going to be for somebody without a hearing impairment. So that's the kind of thing you want to do. Now, one of the tips I got to tell you is, in the hearing aid space we've learned is, you might say, well, hold on, this is great. You've compensated for the hearing loss down to 30 dB. Why are you going back to being linear here? Why don't you keep this curve going all the way down to like 0 dB SPL and try to restore their threshold of hearing, turn them back into a 20-something who hasn't gone to a lot of concerts and worn out their hearing, I might point out, because just being 20 doesn't mean you've got good hearing. Well, the reason we do this is a couple-fold. One of them is sort of, hilariously, I could say, well, is our goal of amplification to give you so much gain that you can hear your goldfish farts? And the goldfish is sitting in the little swimming bowl, swinging around, and it's got to pass some gas. And do we want to hear that? No, we want our fish to have a little sense of privacy. Now, all kidding aside, more pragmatically, in hearing aids, we don't turn that gain up because two things. Microphones have noise, so the input referred noise in the microphone might be about 20 dB. There's no point making that hiss audible. That doesn't help anybody. There's environmental noises like the low-level hum of your refrigerator. It could be doing things that you don't want to hear either. So we try to avoid all that. The other thing in hearing aid space that we have to contend with is, look at this, the maximum gains occurring in quiet. Where does feedback happen? Well, you put a microphone close to a speaker and you put gain, it's just waiting to squeal. So the biggest gain, biggest feedback risk is always down at low levels. And that's why in normal hearing aid fittings, we wouldn't necessarily leave the threshold that low. We would adjust the threshold back and forth, trying to preserve amplification for moderate and loud sounds. So if it turns out and you can use the same trick. So the same thinking I would argue is if your DAW or your tools don't allow you to bring that threshold really far down, don't worry about it. In reality, you're probably going to be monitoring at moderate to loud levels anyhow. You're probably not working on a soundtrack. Well, maybe you are working on the soundtrack for, somebody walking through the woods, listening to the leaves rustling. But anyhow, I wanted to also highlight one other thing while we're on this page, because the thing that's kind of nice about this tool is it allows me to audition the audio real time. So let's start off. I'm going to loop a little music track here. I'm just going to take a quick check here and see that, yep, that's OBS meters are wonderful. They're telling me that should be audible to you guys. And I'm going to come in here and I'm going to increase compression ratio. Now, you might have noticed that I've got this compression running with what I call an anchor point. I set the anchor conveniently to 80 dB SPL equivalent. And as I change compression ratio, it's automatically changing the gain around that. So this is sort of how you could, dial in exactly what you want for your hearing loss. But just to exemplify the next few things, I'm going to crank that compression ratio up higher than you're going to need to. And I'm doing this because I want to focus on sound quality right now. Let me start with what happens if we have, crash, bada boom, bada bing. That didn't work out well. Never fear, we'll just pull it back up. You get to watch live me recreating everything because we don't have enough time to do another take here. So let's go back to fixed compression ratio, bring that up. We were about to do this. I'm looping this soundtrack. And by the way, let me bring this down. If you're listening to this over headphones, this is actually a binaural recording. You can find it on the web. It's a nice orchestra. It's a fun little musical piece, but I thought it'd be fun for the demos here. The other thing I should explain is this cluster of dots. These dots are actually measurements of the input and output levels every 2 milliseconds according to these settings. So you can see there's quite a cluster going on. And one of the things it tells you is that I/O curve does a poor job of predicting where the sound's going to be at any point in time. That is, unless I really shorten up the attack and release time. Let me erase those dots. Now we can see that the sound file's coming out there, and let me turn it up. Hopefully that sounds as distorted for you guys as it does for me. Well, that's got everything to do with the attack and release time. And what I'll do here is I'll turn this up. We'll lengthen up the release time now. I'll reset the dot pattern. So now we've got a longer release time. We see the dots are scattering more, so we're preserving more of the dynamic and things are going good. The one thing I will point out, turn this down a little bit, One of the things you want to watch is, it's normally a case where we typically are doing a fairly fast attack and then some sort of moderate release time. One of the things I'd caution about that is when you track using fast attack time, you're responding to the peaks in that energy, and it's going to tend to pull the average sound level below where you think, where you want. So if you're going to try this out, what I'd encourage you to do is actually, let me stop the display for a brief second. I'll lengthen the attack time here, and then I can turn the display on. But first, let me change the color of the display, and then we'll turn that display on. Now you can see the green dot pattern forming, and notice how it's louder, it's more intense, the output. So where all this was going is when you're using compression, typically, first off, for this task, you're not going to be using high compression ratios because you don't need it to compensate for the loss. But the other thing I'd encourage is look at lengthening the attack time out a little bit so you're not overreacting to the peaks in the music or the speech or whatever it is you're monitoring. It's just a good thing. In terms of distortion, guess what? The lower the compression ratio, the lower the distortion, the longer the attack times, the lower the distortion. Basically, you want to minimize the changes you make to the envelope of the signal. So now that we beat that to death, let's go back to PowerPoint and talk a little bit more about those amplification goals we had. I started off with this saying that's what we wanted. Well, then I quickly pointed out that reality, don't worry about the highest gain things. There's things going on that you just don't need to hear. They're just not that interesting. And avoiding distortion is very key. I mean, we are, by definition, adding some distortion because we are changing the frequency response. So that is a linear type of distortion. What we also want to do is avoid the nonlinear stuff that comes from dynamically changing the gain. So, a little bit of science here. How do we take the audiogram and turn that into our realistic goal target? Well, what I've shown here is the first step of, if we were trying to fit a hearing aid, we take that audiogram, we ram it through one of the prescriptive target systems. This one's from National Acoustics Laboratory down in Australia, and this is their non-linear 2 prescriptive target system. And based on that one audiogram, it generates a variety of targets depending on what the input level is going to be. And so, like I just said, hey, things get loud, no gain needed. The middle curve here is for 65 dB speech, and for those who aren't living this day in, day out, in the audiology field, we typically think of normal conversational speech at 1 meter as being about 65 dB SPL in intensity, so that's why I've got that curve. And so just to continue this journey on in the hearing aid fitting process, what we would do is, now that we have our targets, we are going to push those over into the hearing aid fitting software where we have all kinds of knobs that we can adjust to try and dial this in. We can shape the frequency response. We can change the amount of compression, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how we set up the hearing aid. So we start with a prescriptive target, program that in to try and get the electroacoustic behavior. And then what happens if you're going to somebody who's following best practices is we load you up. We take this probe microphone, which is shown here with the little blue thing. It just hangs on your pinna here, the outer part of your ear. And you can probably see this thin, clear tube. That's actually a probe tube. It's hollow inside. It's silicone, very soft. That gets inserted down to your eardrum so that we can measure, and if we really wanted to, we could listen. But our goal here is we want to measure what the hearing aid is delivering to your eardrum. And this is the speaker from the hearing aid. This one's actually not inserted very well. I can tell this person's not actually a hearing aid wearer. You would never wear the speaker this far out. It would be pushed down. But the rest of the hearing aid is up behind the pinna. But suffice it to say, this picture looked nice, and it's one I had. So those real ear measurements go into the fitting software down here, not the fitting to the real ear measurement software. And I apologize for this display because it's not the best one, but normally you would have targets that you're trying to achieve. And based on what you're actually measuring, you then go back to the hearing aid fitting software and you make adjustments to that, and then you remeasure it. So you're kind of in this loop until you get the verification of the performance at the eardrum. Well, look, it's not practical. We're not going to stick probe mics in anybody's ears for this field. This is meant to be a 15-minute talk that I've already probably going over on, but it's just meant to be some thoughts and ideas. So let's take this hearing aid fitting thing, and rather than doing hearing aid fittings, let's talk about monitoring fittings. So this is what you're going to do. So you don't have access to this prescriptive target. You could buy it. It's $200 US, but I wouldn't bother because I'm going to show you really quickly, it's not what we really need to do. What if we said, let's approximate this? Well, it turns out that a good approximation for hitting the 75 dB target that was the prescriptive target is something called the third gain rule. And I love the third gain rule. The third gain rule says basically take 1/3 of the dBHL losses that you have. So 50 dB loss, a third of that is about 16.5 dB. So there's the max gain you would need. And there's the curve. There's a great looking, that's not a bad approximation up in the high frequencies. In the mid band, we're off a little bit. So this is where we're going to add Steve's wisdom. It turns out if you then bump your crossover frequency up half an octave, you get really, really close to hitting what the prescription would say for 65 dB targets. So once again, here's a super simple math thing you need. Take your audiogram, make a curve that's 1/3 of that, and then bump this corner frequency. Now I'm saying the corner frequency. So if I look at this audiogram, you might instinctively say, hey, that looks about 2 kilohertz. I'll set my corner frequency of my shelving filter or my crossover frequency up at about 2K. Well, it turns out you really need to set it up a little bit higher than that. You need to bump it up about half an octave. Kind of cool, huh? So, things to worry about. The hearing aid fitting formulas up till now are optimized for listening to speech. We sadly do not have a target system for listening to music. It's something that Marcia and I definitely want to explore, push on, because life is far more than listening to speech in quiet. Everything I've said here already assumes that if you're using speakers for monitoring, that they're relatively flat in the sound field. And if that's true, then the gain you provide is insertion gain. And insertion gain in the hearing aid context is what were you unamplified compared to what are you after amplification. So the gain is after correction minus what you walked in the door with. So before we try to do any corrections. If you're monitoring through headphones, I'm making the assumption that your headphones somewhat are diffuse field equalized. So their design target was like a diffuse field. Of course, Sean Olive and the others down at Harman have been working for many years on targets for headphone listening. Feel free to use those. They're really not that much different than a diffuse field response. They get upset. Below 100 hertz, yes, there's a bass boost. Above 100 hertz, it typically follows roughly the diffuse field, although a slight tilt downwards of a couple dB per decade, and that kind of reflects also the newer speaker in room targets. So one thing I'll caution you on is right after World War II, where this whole hearing science and audiometry got interesting and where the goals of amplification came out, the first thing that happened when people saw the audiogram is they said, oh, you got a 50 dB loss. We'll compensate that by providing a 50 dB gain. So there would be your inverted audiogram. That would be the gain you need. While true, if you want to hear down to 0 dB, it's not a useful gain whatsoever for real life conditions, because remember, everybody's environment, even in your home environment, I mean, my environment here measures about 32 dB A weighted. I can get a little lower if I turn off my furnace this time of the year, and I will do that for critical measurements, but much of your world is never that quiet anyhow. Don't worry about it. So a more sensible target would have been this 65 down here. Sensible targets don't even try to compensate for the threshold of hearing. They don't try to restore hearing all the way down to zero. They try to compensate down to perhaps 50 dB type levels. And more typical levels would be like the 65, etc. So there you go. So shoot for a reasonable amount of gain. Multiband compression may help you. Keep the distortion as low as possible. Don't be afraid to do a shelving filter trick. You can set that up if the track that you're monitoring or that segment is fairly stationary. There's not a huge amount of dynamics. Put that in because that'll have the least amount of distortion. And one of the thoughts that hit me in getting ready for all this is maybe we should develop a plugin that would actually do exactly the kinds of things that we talked about here and make it easy for everybody. So that would be kind of fun. So maybe depending on the feedback, let's go with that. So I'm going to pause it there. If there's any questions that don't get answered through the online meeting, you can always reach out through my email address, audiosteve@gmail.com. So with that, I just want to say thanks a lot for partaking and look forward to meeting you guys in person soon.
Thank you for attending tonight's presentation of the Toronto Audio Engineering Society. The Toronto Audio Engineering Society unites engineers socially. Within our allied arts, we collect, collate, and disseminate scientific knowledge that furthers all fields of audio engineering. The AES aims to empower people of all ages through participation in healthy, safe, open community presentations. Learn about audio engineering through events, presentations, networking, and mentorship. Visit www.torontoaes.org to join today.
Well, that is everything for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Remember to check our newsletter, to check our Twitter, our Instagram, our Facebook for more updates on our next events and meetings and all sorts of tours that we give out once in a while. And we'll be back to giving once we're able to post-COVID. And enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much for coming along. Bye-bye.